Okay, hi everyone. Sorry for a short delay, and today we will listen to a talk about continuous localization, a very important topic. And we have Dwayne and Ryan to talk about it. And what can I say? Dwayne has been involved with open source since 2001 and worked with portal and translation toolkits. And Ryan works with him, and let's give them a round of applause. Thank you.
Thanks very much for having us. So I'm Dwayne. I work at Translate House and working on Poodle for quite a while. I'm kind of one of the founding creators of the software. Ryan's the lead developer at the moment. And our focus today is looking at continuous localization, both in terms of how it is able to be done and maybe some of the things that we need to take forward in terms of open source. So just a little bit of background in terms of history of us as an organization and what we've been involved in. I'm from South Africa, and started working on the official languages of South Africa, so translating open source software, basically because it was the most powerful vehicle we had to influence software and to change the way software worked. In fact, it was quite a critical thing to get other people like Microsoft actually translating software by translating something like, at the time, OpenOffice. That moved into an Africa-wide network, looking at issues of localization across the continent. And at the moment we focus on kind of worldwide issues and trying to help teams that are localizing across the world. The reason why we got into tools and tooling was really to address some of the shortcomings we saw in open source. So every tool that we developed was trying to tackle something. Poodle specifically was designed because we were struggling to get good tools into the hands of localizers. But we built things like the Translate Toolkit, which looks at quality checks and does format conversion. So that was also about how to enable localizers. We have a tool called Fatal, which is an offline translation tool. And then Amagama, which is a massive free and open source software translation memory. 2004 was when we launched Poodle, and my daughter was young there. And now Poodle is a teenager, and so is my daughter. So it's grown up, it's stronger, but it's a little bit more opinionated now as well. So the time I've been involved in localization, and I'm a bit of an accidental localizer. My training is in mechanical engineering, but I got involved in localization because of the impact it could have on people. But we've seen some of that process, and I'm not a localizer from the 80s, but really the systems that we've had in place, and in some projects are still active. It's a matter of getting work via email, translating it, sending it back to review, sending it back to be fixed, landing it, and then a few months later actually releasing it. But things have changed over the years. Some of the things that we saw, the first translation of Microsoft software into a South African language would never actually be translated again. So there were mistakes, and they wouldn't be fixed. They would just roll over to the next. And that's very much an old school view that people have moved out of. In a space where people were translating 10, 15, if you were a radically progressive organization, you'd probably be doing 35 languages. But the first thing we start seeing, we see it happen even with Ubuntu, just exposing translations to other people and making it a little bit divorced from the actual release. We see Microsoft started doing language pack concepts and getting that out. And we see quite quickly Facebook and Twitter doing massive community-based localizations. And we're looking at things like hundreds of languages. So in the present day, we are looking at translation processes that need to deal with lots and lots of languages. And that's the reality we're in. The world's changing. You're having to deliver rapidly. You're having to think about mobile and web apps. You've got multiple different targets. You've got new markets. 20% of the web are native English speakers and the rest are growing. All the languages that are really growing in terms of multi-digit % every year are things like Russian, Chinese, Spanish is counted there as well. English is growing, but not as big as these other languages, and more people are coming on board with mobile. In fact, I think it's 2013 was the year in which more people were using mobile to access the web than were using desktops. So a very, very dynamic change and a very dynamic change in the environment. And that's kind of why we're having to look at continuous localization, certainly in the open source space. I just wanted to quickly valorize localizers, because I don't think we spend enough time focusing on the effort that they put in and why we want to look at continuous localization from that to assist them. Often localization processes are really built around the developers. They're built to support the development process. And it's time that we honour the people who work really, really hard across often multiple projects, multiple formats, multiple tools, etc., etc., etc. A kind of environment that developers are not really used to. But people are really, really passionate about advancing their language. And so that's some of the motivation of why continuous localization is critical, because it's about how do we make these people really, really effective. Some of the processes that we've seen over the years that we want to try look at fixing, and we think continuous localization is part of what fixes that. Strangely enough, if you're looking at continuous localization as things moving more quickly, we feel that some of the way you can approach continuous localization will actually effectively reduce the load on translators, really focusing on which things are more important than other things, providing much more context in a way of translators getting context that they might not usually do. Having a strong focus on quality in the same way that continuous integration looks at checks. Having really quick processes that can allow strings to be turned around very, very quickly, and actually breaking the concept, which I think a lot of people have loved for too long, of string freezes, that there's a deadline at which you can't change things, but actually creating a system that is much, much more dynamic. The key ideas for us in terms of continuous localization is really trying to look at reducing the friction in the process. So which are the processes that require manual intervention or intervention that is not helpful for the localization process? How do you oil those well? How do you eliminate them, or how do you reduce the cost of them? Obviously, reducing and eliminating manual processes because they become blockers in terms of process. Organizational memory is a critical thing, and Ryan will talk much more to it, in terms of how do we learn and how do we continue to learn within the space of translation. It's quite critical in open source because we have a flow and movement of translators all the time. The visibility of progress, so people can see what they're working on, what they should be working on. The critical thing for me as well is how do we empower the right people, expecting developers to make comments about the strings that need to translate, where a translator might have a much better context and a much better idea of how that impacts their language. I'd rather empower the translator in that context. And the other thing that we see continuous localization helping is the idea of releasing early and often. So not working out processes that allow us to push languages out as quickly as they are ready, and to do that continually, which is more a reflection of the reality. So I just wanted to quickly leap into things that we feel that people should be doing right now if you're not doing anything around continuous localization. The first most critical thing, and we see it too often, is that bad translations and broken translations can break products. So we have a strong belief that translations, we want to catch those problems earlier, but as a first bet, nothing that you send out as a product, if it's mistranslated in some way, should be able to break the product. So I mean actually physically breaking it, that you get a traceback or a crash. And that happens too often, and we're still working in a space sometimes in open source where we allow that to happen. So we need to break that. If you are currently using continuous integration, and I doubt there's many people who don't do that, it's kind of critical that you're starting to look at localization being part of that. catching localization-related errors, whether it's breakages in the translations that you can actually automate and detect, whether it's extraction of strings that you haven't done. Those kind of things need to be put into your process right now. And I'd recommend people start looking at one of our tools, which is the Translate Toolkit, and actually start looking at how you can automate some of that in terms of the build environment, so that you're not actually allowing translations that break products to enter into the build and never get out. I'm going to hand over to Ryan, who's going to take stuff and look at it much more from a continuous integration model in terms of what we're trying to do.
Yeah, hi. So we've worked with software for years, both Dwayne and myself, and one thing we saw very clearly was that using continuous integration techniques allowed us to both improve the quality of the software and speed up that process. And so the big question for us really were, can we apply those processes to localization? And I think a similar question really that we've asked is, are there any processes in localization specific to that could also assist in terms of continuous integration and continuous localization? So within localization, obviously we have quality checks, and as Dwayne mentioned just previously, the Translate Toolkit provides many such checks. I think the ultimate aim is to prevent the strings ever reaching the build process, so that they don't break builds and they don't break the built product. But I think with continuous integration, it's not just about fixing bugs. It's about taking the process. So it's about stepping back and saying, what was the cause of that bug, and putting in place the process to prevent that. And then even further, taking a further step back and saying, what causes that class of bugs, and how can we prevent that class of bugs from happening? Within localization, there's obviously already the quality checks, but that also provides metrics. It's not simply about whether or not a build can pass or fail. It's also about whether or not the developers and localizers have sight of change in the process. So I think one of the things we've been really looking at recently is really two different sets of checks. And if we use GitHub, I think other repositories have similar mechanisms, but it can show you basically if your continuous integration tests are failing, or other metrics about any change that you're proposing. And really what we'd like to do is to have something similar. So when developers make commits to the branch, they can see this has added so many strings. The translators can see that those strings have been added straight away. And then on the flip side, when the translations are being committed to the repository, the checks that are currently happening in the translation environment could also potentially be happening at that point of change. So another key aspect is improving the communication. For localizers, one of the most challenging parts of their job is really getting the context of what that string is used for. The same string obviously or the same words could mean quite different things in different contexts. So for translators, that takes up a large amount of their time trying to get the context to give an appropriate translation. So one thing we'd really like to look at is how we can improve that communication flow between the developers and then conversely back from the developers to the translators. But there's also a lot within a language team that could be improved. The kind of checks that people develop are quite often specific to their language, but quite often they're not, and they work with other languages as well. So really what we're looking at is how we can increase communication within language teams, between language teams, and with language teams to developers. So just taking a quick step back, 10, 15 years ago, developing software, if a project was forked, it was really seen as the absolute worst thing that could happen to a project, pretty much the death knell of a project. And GitHub came along and basically started encouraging people to fork, and they kind of put this ribbon on, people put this ribbon on the website saying, fork me on GitHub. And that really changed the way in which people saw software forking. Nowadays, most projects will look on their GitHub page or what have you, and they'll regard it as a success metric that more people are forking their software. Quite the opposite to what happened in the past. In part, that change has come about just because of distributed versioning. It allows you to have local branches more easily, push changes between those local branches, but also have a shared upstream or even potentially multiple shared upstreams. But I think the real change came not with distributed versioning, it came with the pull request, because the pull request allowed you to not only fork, but to offer those changes back and to make it very clear what changes you were offering back to the core branch. So I think for localization to adopt some of those practices, really the area that we're looking at right now is how we can branch and how we can diff and how we can merge those changes back. How we can apply that very successful process from software into the localization process. So, I mean, we developed Poodle, but I know that others are looking at similar technologies. I think a pretty critical part to making it frictionless is that VCS hookup. So as soon as developers are committing strings, they're appearing in whatever tool that you use to localize. And conversely, as soon as you're making changes, or soon after you're making changes to your localization, those are appearing back in the repository. Poodle started out mostly as a file-based editor, and even now, even very large, complex projects tend to have a very file-based view of localization. And one of the things that we're moving towards is much more seeing localization as a data source, so we can work not just with PO files, what have you, but directly with databases, or potentially even with websites or other sources of localization. So, as I said before, previously we worked mostly with PO. Nowadays the localization landscape has dramatically changed, and even within a single project you're likely to see more than one localization format. So that's a pretty critical aspect, being able to integrate with those projects, is being able to work with the variety of formats that they work with. So there are some technologies that are quite specific to localization and are pretty relevant in terms of building that organizational memory. I think translation memory being probably the most obvious one. For those that aren't aware, it allows you to see how a string was translated previously and gives you some prompts in how you might translate it. The other one that's a pretty significant aspect and very much increasingly so is machine translation. Historically, machine translation has been pretty poor. That's changing pretty quickly, but it's also useful as an aid to speed up that localization process. Even if it doesn't give you a perfect string, it can give you some pretty good prompts. So just finishing up, just within Translate House, our main goal around this is to support more free and open source projects. We're very much from the sort of free and open source world, and I think for most within our organisation, that's our main aim, is to see as much open source software localised in as many languages as possible. But we'd like to make localisation a given. I mean, walking around the conference, talking to people, even now, many big projects just don't localise their software. And I think nowadays the technology is there that makes it a lot easier, and the internet has meant that the market is so much greater, so the need to do that is so much more. So, final thing just to say, we're looking for we're always looking for localizers, but we're also looking for coders who might have a passion around localization, or widening participation in the internet and the web more generally. So, any questions? You want to come up and ask questions?
Okay, thank you. Questions? Yes?
Hi. So if you plan to use like a unified storage system for localization, how would you put it together, given that different localization formats have different feature sets? So some may have plurals, some may not have plurals, some may, like L20 has a lot of extra features. So how would you do that in a unified storage model?
Well, answering that. Answering that specifically in terms of Poodle, currently Poodle still uses an internal representation that's pretty much like Poe, which gives it some limitations, but Poe is a pretty robust format, so you can express most of the other formats in that way. But I would say, I mean, for us, the answer to that question is Poodle. Poodle is where we bring localizations from different projects, from different formats, and we put them into one place where localizers can see them in one, in one interface.
I think the critical thing as well in terms of comparison and diffing and that kind of stuff is the needs of localization in terms of the diff become rather different. Like we don't really want to see how the layout or the formatting changed. We want to see the content of the string that changed. And that's really what we're wanting to see diffed in terms of the differences that are coming from different places and work out how to merge them.
Any other questions?
Talking about teams and building up with localizators, what would you suggest if there's someone showing up with a rare language that's not in the local database, no glibc support or anything, so a new language? Do you recommend they will start translating the PO files or go to the source first so that they get support for the basics?
So my kind of view is not to discourage anyone.
Please take the question.
Yeah. So I mean my passion is to see even the smallest language like active and activated. On a Linux system, not having a glibc locale can be a bit of a barrier, but a lot of places it isn't. The stuff, in the kind of African context, we tackled the missing locale problem by just making it go away, and we addressed that. We built like 100 locales. I would encourage someone like that to look at building a locale. I haven't looked at it for a while, whether the CLDR data is pulled directly into glibc. That would probably be the most effective way of actually doing it. They're not very hard to do if you basically read South African English one, because I documented it all. But my thing would be, I think the critical takeaway for me is I don't like seeing any barriers prevent someone. So I'd rather help someone like that tackle the glibc locale thing, because it will go away. Once that's done, it's literally gone and then they're free to carry on.
Okay, thank you. Other questions?
I work together with the AsteroidOS team to manage translations there, and one of the troubles we're running into is that we have the applications which are all Qt, so we have the Qt translation system for all the strings in the application, and then we have the desktop files which contain the app name that also needs to be translated. We're currently using Weblate for that. But we can only translate the in-app strings, and we have to try to find a way to personally contact the translators to get the desktop entries translated. Do you have any tips on how to handle situations like that?
Yeah, I'm not. So you've got one part that's able to be translated in Weblate, and one part that's not. Is that
Yeah, the Qt part can be translated in Weblate,
yeah.
and the rest is a .desktop file which Weblate doesn't support, and you can't.
Oh, yeah, that's fun. So, I mean, I would look at the GNOME tool which allows you to translate .desktop files, and then convert it to PO, which might be an approach, because I'm pretty sure then you could translate it in PO format.
Okay, thanks.
Other questions? Hang on.
You were talking about quality of translation earlier. What's your process to ensure that you have good quality translations? Because presumably different translators will, in the same language, will translate differently.
So especially when you're dealing with volunteer translators, the metrics that I'm looking at is making sure that you've got, depending on the maturity of the language, looking that you've got the resources that enhance translation. So well-defined terminology, followed by translation memory. That would be how I try to look at consistency. The thing that we want to see language teams specifically do is actually build quality metric tests that can actually ensure that. But the critical thing we've found is that actually before translation memory is to get consistent terminology that relates to the domain that they're translating. And that's the kind of first step of getting at consistency.
I think part of the answer to that is about tone as well, because somebody can translate something completely correctly, but it may not be the tone that was intended where the string is used. So I think in that, one of the key things there is not necessarily a continuous localization, because it's about building those teams that can give the right oversight and training to the localizers.
Hi. So, as a French web developer, one of the recurring issues that we face is that when we translate English text that fills a tiny button, we translate it in French, and then it overflows very often because French words are often longer than English words. Do you have any suggestion on how to handle that more systematically, graphical screenshots or anything?
And there are a few approaches. One is to not have a UI that allows you to overflow. Because I think the reality with translations, and the common problem, is that all translations inflate from the original. So they will get bigger, like 20%, 10%, depends on the language. There are a few approaches. One is to physically place limits on things and put checks in place that limit that. The problem with that is that you end up with really difficult to understand translations. So my first thing would be actually looking at how you can adapt the UI and see if that's the first possibility. In terms of screenshots and that, we've been toying with a bit of those ideas and thinking what we could do there. The difficult with screenshots is trying to figure out how you could automate that a bit so that you can see when things overflow. And I'm not sure how to do that.
It's also worth mentioning in-place localization. It's not something that Prusa does at the moment. It's something certainly we've considered developing. But with in-place localization systems, you really go to the web page and you translate from the web page, so then the localizers can see the space available. But pretty much any localizer I've ever spoke to would say that's not what we want. We want you to make a UI that's going to work for our translation, not the other way around.
Okay. Any other questions? We have time. Keep your hand up.
Thanks. I have a question that about a feature that is usually available in translation software. It's about terminology, which wasn't mentioned there. What is your thoughts about the extensive uses of terminology in order to improve the quality of translations?
I think it depends a little bit on what's being translated. Last year I was in India and working with some government organisations there, and the point they made is that without the terminology, even within a single language, the same word, because it's a relatively new word, may be translated many different ways. And for an organisation as big as the Indian government, they're dealing with, I think they've got eight official large languages and many dialects. So I think terminology provides, particularly for newer terms, a way of standardising that and preventing it from being translated 100 different ways. So I think it's a very important one.
I mean, I think addressing it in a continuous localization thing for me is, I think often terminology is neglected, but it's really empowering the translators. That would be my passion, is seeing the translators actually developing the terminology that applies to the domain that they're localizing. So the words they have problems with, but that becomes the terminology for that problem domain.
Hi there. You were talking about, as a part of continuous integration, it's a good idea to try to detect broken strings, for example. How would you concretely go about that? Does that mean you create a build of your software and then you have to kind of start it up and run through a bunch of acceptance tests to see that the software doesn't crash, for example, because of a weird string? Or do you do screenshotting or this kind of thing? Or what's the approach there?
So the question is, how do you prevent strings from breaking builds, and how can you put in place those processes? I think there's not a single answer to that. I think at the moment, for example, in Poodle, you can translate things and it will show where there's critical errors. One of the things that we've talked about quite a lot, we'd like to add, is the ability to have something a bit like a pull request. So when somebody makes a bunch of changes, you could see that that's going to create so many critical checks, critical fails. And the critical fails tend to be the kind of things that will break a build. Ideally, they wouldn't get into your master translations. Ideally, they would be reviewed, and as part of that review process, that would be prevented. Much like with a pull request, if it goes off to Travis and it fails, people won't land it. But I think there's a second part to that which we don't have yet, but something that would be very nice to have, is literally at the point where pull requests are made to push the translation strings, those checks are repeated again, so the developers can see that coming in to their repository.
I mean, just to raise one of those things, I mean, I think we actually unpicked it from our app, but it's an approach that I would do as kind of like if you're looking at things as like walls of defense. The one was if a string does fail to be translated, so either something happens when you're trying to get the string. Our app is using gettext, so it's that approach. Or it fails to interpolate, so the variables are translated or broken in some way. And we fall back to English. So English is not ideal in a UI, but it's better than crashing or breaking. So that would be my first line of defense. But our things with continuous localization is trying to bring that further forward. So a simple one would be, if it is gettext, even using gettext itself to see if the file compiles, and that you're not pushing it out with a compiled file that's broken, which is quite possible in certain contexts when you're not necessarily using gettext directly. And then the translate toolkit will do things that we actually look for variables. We can write tests that look for variables that are broken, or XML that's broken, or etc. And XML becomes quite a problematic one where, especially if you're doing some kind of interpretation on it, you're expecting the XML to look a certain way. You've used names that look eminently translatable, like page or color, and people then translate it. So just building those checks in so that they're caught right at the beginning. And so I think the critical thing in builds is that and the problem with some of the automated checks is that they do need to be a kind of 100% accurate. So you can't really deal with false positives in that space. But there's enough checks that you can build to catch those right there and prevent them ever even going out.
Thanks.
Keep your hand up.
Hi. Sort of related to the same question previously. So if we already have, say, a test suite that we put the localizations through when they come in back from Poodle or Transifex or whatever we might be using at the time, would there be, would you envision some sort of mechanism or protocol whereby you could integrate your own systems to report back to maybe Poodle if, say, the the translators will make 20 changes on 20 strings. And somehow that magically in the background creates a pull request, then the source control and the CI tools will come back and report and say, right, these two strings here failed with this error message and stuff like that. And would you think of some integration tools to sort of limit the going back and forth and like helping translate things quicker?
So the question is, if we've got any things in place that would stop it at the pull request or the changes landing in the repository. I think, and whether or not we could get that communication back into Poodle or into other tools. I mean, I don't see why not. In some respects, I would say that if it's certainly in terms of how we're thinking this at the moment, if it's failing in Poodle, it's going to fail on landing into GitHub. It's going to run. We're assuming it's going to run the same checks. So that in Poodle they would have that communication already. In terms of TransFX or other online platforms, I mean, potentially we could expose some kind of API. I'm not sure. We haven't really thought that far ahead.
I think from my side, like the critical place to catch it is right in the tool itself. That would be my ideal. Like reporting back at a later date works, but it does mean that the translator then is out of the loop. They're not on that string anymore. So the ideal would be to catch it earlier.
Okay, I don't see any other questions. Thank you so much, and let's end it.